The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, has entered new and highly controversial territory by approving pesticides that fall under the broad category of PFAS, a per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS are commonly known as forever chemicals because of their extraordinary persistence. Once they enter the environment, they do not readily break down, and once they enter the human body, they can linger for years. Regulators, scientists, and public health advocates have long regarded these compounds with deep concern. Their molecular stability makes them useful in many industrial applications, but that same stability is what allows them to accumulate in soil, water, wildlife, and human tissue. Last week's EPA decision to approve 2 new PFAS-based pesticides and the reporting that the agency plans to authorize 4 more in the near future signals a potential shift in how the United States manages the risks associated with these chemicals. The Washington Post coverage and subsequent statements from the EPA suggest that the agency is pursuing a more permissive stance on certain PFAS, positioning the decision as grounded in scientific evaluation and regulatory transparency. Yet many observers, including environmental and health advocates, view the approvals as a rollback of long-standing caution around the use of PFAS in agriculture. To understand why these approvals have generated so much controversy, it is important to consider what PFAS are, why they have become the focus of intense regulatory attention, and what it means to apply PFAS-containing pesticides to food crops that enter the national food supply. What are PFAS and why are they concerning? PFAS are a class of more than 12,000 synthetic chemicals that have been used for decades in products that require durability, water resistance, heat tolerance, or nonstick properties. They appear in firefighting foams, waterproof clothing, nonstick cookware, certain medical devices, and industrial surfactants. Their engineered carbon-fluorine bonds are among the strongest found in chemistry, which is precisely why they resist degradation in natural conditions. The scientific community's concerns about PFAS stem not only from their persistence, but from research linking certain PFAS to various health problems. While not all PFAS have been studied thoroughly, something that complicates regulation, those that have been examined showed troubling associations. Studies have linked exposure to some PFAS with increased risks of specific cancers, immune system suppression, thyroid disorders, high cholesterol, liver damage, and developmental effects in fetuses and infants. The prompt mentions earth defects, presumably meaning birth defects. Indeed, concerns about PFAS and developmental toxicity remain an important part of the scientific discourse. Human exposure happens when PFAS contaminates drinking water, accumulates in fish and wildlife, migrates from food packaging, or makes its way into crops grown on contaminated soil. The idea that pesticides themselves might be a direct route of agricultural PFAS exposure raises obvious alarms. If PFAS-based pesticides are used on crops such as romaine lettuce, broccoli, or potatoes, foods that Americans consume frequently and often with minimal processing, then exposure pathways could become more direct and widespread. Traditionally, environmental and health agencies in the U.S. and abroad have taken a precautionary approach toward PFAS. In recent years, several states moved to restrict PFAS in consumer goods, and the Biden administration's EPA made PFAS contamination a major policy priority, proposing strict drinking water limits and promising aggressive action to reduce environmental exposure. Against this backdrop, the approval of PFAS-based pesticides appears contradictory. It suggests either that the specific PFAS compounds in these pesticides are viewed by the EPA as materially different from the better-known hazardous PFAS, or that the agency is recalibrating its risk assessment framework in a way that allows certain PFAS to move forward despite incomplete data. The EPA's public statement that it will provide transparent, science-based information on how these chemicals are evaluated indicates an awareness of the controversy. Transparency is vital, especially because pesticide approvals are grounded in complex toxicological assessments, environmental modeling, and sometimes industry-provided safety data. Critics often argue that evaluations of emerging chemicals lack independence or fail to fully consider cumulative exposure, particularly with substances as persistent as PFAS. Agricultural use and potential exposure. The agricultural application of PFAS-containing pesticides introduces specific questions about environmental transport and human exposure. When a pesticide is applied to a crop, it can remain on the plant surface and be ingested directly. Leafy greens like romaine lettuce are most relevant here as they are consumed raw and have large surface areas. Be absorbed into plant tissues. Root vegetables such as potatoes could accumulate chemical residues internally, potentially making washing or peeling less effective. Leach into soil and groundwater. Because PFAS resist degradation, they could accumulate in agricultural soils, eventually migrating to water supplies or affecting future crop cycles, even if the pesticide is no longer used. Affect farm workers and surrounding communities. Spray drift, runoff, and occupational exposure create additional pathways for PFAS to enter human and ecological systems. Given PFAS's tenacity, critics argue that allowing even a limited subset of these chemicals into routine agricultural use could create long-term contamination challenges that are extremely costly and sometimes technologically difficult to reverse. A central issue is that PFAS is an umbrella term. The class includes substances with different sizes, structures, functional groups, and toxicological profiles. Some may pose high-risk health cases, while others may be less hazardous. The problem is that scientific understanding is uneven, and data gaps persist. The pesticides approved by the EPA fall into the PFAS category because of their fluorinated chemical structures, but details about their specific toxicology, environmental persistence, and long-term human health effects are either limited or not publicly well known. The Washington Post reporting states that not much is known about their long-term impact, which raises concerns about whether the EPA's approval is based on robust evidence or on assumptions of safety in the absence of data. Scientists and environmental advocates caution that history offers examples of chemical classes initially deemed benign and later found harmful after years of widespread use. PFAS themselves follow this pattern. For decades, chemicals like PFOA and PFOS were used widely before scientists uncovered the extent of their environmental persistence and health risks. Critics worry about repeating that trajectory with newly approved fluorinated pesticides. From a public health perspective, the precautionary principle is often invoked when dealing with persistent and potentially bioaccumulative chemicals. This principle suggests that when scientific uncertainty exists, especially regarding compounds that may remain in the environment for centuries, regulators should err on the side of avoiding exposure until safety is clearly established. Allowing PFAS into agricultural pesticide formulations appears to move in the opposite direction. While the EPA promises transparency and scientific rigor, health advocates argue that true transparency requires releasing detailed toxicological assessments, environmental modeling, and long-term projections for public scrutiny. Moreover, the approval comes at a time when many communities across the U.S. are grappling with PFAS contamination in drinking water. Billions of dollars are being spent on remediation efforts, lawsuits, and medical monitoring. For policymakers who have fought to clean up legacy PFAS contamination, the idea of authorizing new PFAS chemicals for broad agricultural use seems counterproductive. Industry and regulatory arguments. On the other hand, supporters of these approvals, often including pesticide manufacturers and some agricultural groups, typically argue that not all PFAS should be treated as inherently dangerous. Some fluorinated compounds degrade faster or have lower bioaccumulative potential. The new pesticides may offer agricultural benefits, such as improved pest control, reduced crop loss, or lower application frequencies, which could reduce the use of other, potentially more harmful chemicals. Regulatory evaluation should be chemical-specific, not class-wide. These arguments are not without merit. Chemical regulation must be precise, and banning an entire class without nuance could stifle innovation. Yet, such reasoning depends on the strength and transparency of the underlying safety data that critics say have not been fully disclosed. The EPA's move fits within a broader global debate about how to manage PFAS. The European Union has proposed sweeping restrictions on thousands of PFAS, aiming to eliminate most uses, except when essential. The United States, by contrast, has taken a slower, more piecemeal approach. The agricultural sector is a particularly sensitive arena because public confidence in the safety of the food supply is paramount. Even the perception that food crops may carry residues of forever chemicals can undermine trust, with implications for farmers, retailers, and regulators. The EPA's decision to approve pesticides containing PFAS marks a significant and controversial shift in U.S. chemical policy. While the agency maintains that its evaluations are scientific grounded and transparent, many scientists, policymakers, and public health advocates remain unconvinced, citing the well-documented risks of PFAS exposure and the limited data available on the newly approved